Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our State Library Lunch and Learn series featuring Pennsylvania authors. Today, we will hear Dave Tamanini as he discusses his book, Tituba, The Intentional Witch of Salem, a unique Salem 1692 witchcraft story. Part fantasy, part historical fiction, and set in the era of the Salem witchcraft trials, the book is based on Tituba, the first woman accused of witchcraft in colonial Salem and an enslaved person. Mr. Tamanini takes a provocative look at colonial America's shameful witch hunts and a central but forgotten figure. In this program, we will learn more about the Salem witch trials from an untold story that will work its magic on you. And a little bit about the author. Born in northeastern coal region of Pennsylvania, Dave lived in lots of places while growing up in a U.S. military family. After college, he landed a job as a civil rights investigator of race and gender discrimination. That work in the legal field led him to the University of Detroit Law School and then private law practice for 30 years. During his work as a lawyer, he helped clients from all walks of life and learned about human strength, frailty, and hypocrisy. Now, Dave writes fiction in Harrisburg, PA, while cherishing family and staying in touch with old friends and new. And now I will turn it over to our guest speaker. Welcome, Mr. Tamanini.
Thank you, Ellen. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today. It's been a long journey from back in the days when I worked for the State Human Relations Commission and first was exposed to folks that I didn't come in contact with growing up. I'd like to talk about my book and how the journey was in creating that book and the characters. Historical fiction is, and especially historical fantasy fiction, has to have the elements that all good fiction has. It has to have characters that are rounded. It has to have the arc of the conflict, the individual arc of conflict among the characters. It has to have a plot. It has to move. It has when there's an element of fantasy, it's still important to have a deep dive into the real lives and the real events of the time, even down to what they ate their food off of, or how cold it was in their homes in the wintertime. So I'm real happy to get into individual things if you got specific questions.
Could you tell us about the transition from lawyer to author and how you were inspired specifically to write about Tituba and the witch trials?
Yes. Well, I practiced law in Harrisburg in a small general practice law office for 34 years. When I decided to retire in, I think, 2012, I still stayed with the Bar Association, and I went to one of their, what were called lunch and learns, just like this. Lawyers have to keep a certain number of credits every year to maintain proficiency in various fields. And so we would have these kind of educational programs during a luncheon. So it was called Lunch and Learn. After I retired, I stayed with the Bar Association, and one day the director of the Bar Association told me that they were going to have a historian, the librarian from the Dickinson Penn State Law School, come to do the Lunch and Learn, and he was going to talk about witchcraft. I thought, that's interesting. How's that going to be continuing legal education? Well, the whole concept of due process and fair trials and evidence, it was all relevant, but this was going to be a fun CLE, continuing legal ed. So I went, and I had been casting around for a story to write, and I wanted to have some legal elements to it because I had spent a career in the law, but I also was fascinated by this story that the law librarian had put in front of us that day. And so I started digging in. For me, the transition from lawyer to researcher was the first step. At the same time of researching, developing skills in the craft of writing. It's kind of funny that one of my colleagues here in Dauphin County, after I made an announcement to him that, I was going to be an author, he said, "Dave, you've been writing fiction for the last 34 years. It shouldn't be too hard for you." Well, I took it in the right grain because, of course, he was just kidding with me. But moving from being an attorney where you are trained to do research, to analyze what you read, to question what you read, was a perfect basis for me to move into the field of writing. I had always wanted to be a writer. I started in high school working on the high school yearbook and through college. So for me, the transition was easy, and I had got my fill of practicing law after 34 years. I really wanted to do something different, and it was a bucket list type of thing.
Historical fiction is a difficult genre to write because while there's an element of creativity, there's also the need to be historically accurate where relevant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you tell us about your process of research, character development, and message choosing?
Yes. Actually, one of the first things I did, was dig into the books. I don't know how many folks that are listening today have ever been to Salem. I never had. And for me, it was a total blank. The only thing I knew about the colonial era of New England was the Puritans and Lexington and Concord. And that was a big hole in my knowledge of the entire area. So I dug into the reading. There were several things that started to strike me, one of which is Tituba being the first person accused of witchcraft, I think has been forgotten in history. She was enslaved. The master was the village minister. So Tituba lived in the parsonage, and in the parsonage, the minister's daughter Betty and his niece Abigail were the first ones who exhibited symptoms of what people came to believe were bewitchment or falling under the control of Satan. And so for me, first was the books, comparing history. But the way Arthur Miller treated Tituba, I found that offensive, really. My history in working in civil rights, my long career in serving clients, and I always represented a diverse field of clients when it comes to culture or ethnic background or what we call race in America. And she seemed kind of to be treated as a fool. One of the secrets of good writing is, and so many of you certainly know this, it's to ask who, what, when, where, and why in order to make a story. Who are the characters? What did they do? When, where, why did they do it? And to me, the critical question was why? Why did Tituba start naming witches? And after she was accused, she started naming other witches. And that essentially was the kickoff for the hysteria. Well, with my background in civil rights, knowing how Black people were often ignored and written out of history, and that no one knows about Tituba, what happened to her, I thought I'd kind of dig into that character. But I also wanted to dig into other characters. You have to have a protagonist and an antagonist. Well, the antagonist was the minister, and also the patriarchal system of Puritan religion in the area. It was married so closely to law that, for example, performing witchcraft was a sin, but the civil law enforced the criminal, not the civil law, but the legal system enforced the punishment. That's the way it worked all the way back in Europe when it came to heretics and witches and so forth. So for me, I have a couple of slides. After starting to dig into the history, of course, we had to make visits to Salem, and I've been up there numerous times. And Nicole, can you show one of the slides? This is, well, guess who? That's me, and I'm standing in front of the reproduction of the meeting house in Salem. This was created by the producers of the movie The Crucible, in which Daniel Day-Lewis was starring. And after the movie was over, it was moved to this site, which is a historical site in Salem, open to the public. Anybody can walk through it. And I took a couple of shots from the inside. If you can show the next one, Nicole. This is actually the loft inside. This is where children sat, as well as slaves and servants, sometimes visitors. On the first floor, everyone, of course, had assigned seats, and it was based on status. The men generally were separated from the women, and in that day and age, of course, women were not treated as fully participants in the community. The next slide will show that's the stairway going up to the loft, the balcony. The next slide should show the communion table and the pulpit. Whoops, there it is. So if you look closely, you can see a communion table in front of what is the pulpit. And that communion table was normally down off of that dais and to the side. So when people would come up for communion, they would go to that table. But for the trials, they put this table up on the dais, and the judges who were conducting preliminary hearings in that venue, in that meeting house, were presiding. People came up very close to the table when they were testifying. The children were sitting or standing, the children who were the first accusers, being allegedly bewitched, were within 3 feet of that table. And the accused person who was accused of witchcraft was another 2 feet farther away. And the crowd was all tight, up close. You can imagine the bedlam that was always on the edge of happening during this event, during these hearings. First, the hearings were done in Salem, and then the hearings were held in Salem Village, which was the agricultural, rural portion of Salem town. And the trials were later held in Salem itself. So in Salem Village, this area where this reproduction is now called Danvers, Massachusetts. Many people believe that they changed the name of their town out of shame for what occurred in the witch hunts and the accusations, the wild accusations, the numerous hundreds of lives upended. 19 people were hanged. One died being pressed to death because he would not submit to the jurisdiction of the court. Some died in prison, awaiting hearings or trials. And babies were born in prison. So this is where the preliminary Tituba. I wanted to show the absolute absence and uncaringness of the court system for legitimate evidence and due process to human beings, and how they were basically judged guilty until they could prove themselves innocent. Can you show the next slide? These are the remains that were uncovered in the last 35 years of the actual parsonage where Tituba, Reverend Samuel Parris, her master, and the children, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, lived with Mrs. Parris. Tituba, her husband, John Indian, who is also featured in the book, and their son, Akani, lived in a parsonage that was 2 stories tall, was approximately 20 feet by 14 feet in outside measurements. It had a lean-to built on the side around 1692 when Parris was living there. And that's where, in my story, Tituba worked, slept with John Indian, her husband, and their son, Akani. And in the rest of this 2-story house, can you imagine a house that small? It's almost the size of modern family rooms, actually. And in that house, there was a great chimney in the great room, which was used for everything from eating to visiting. People would visit from the parish with the minister. Social events were rare, but prayer meetings were held in this area as well. So this shows 2 foundations. The one on the left was built, I'm sorry, the one on the right was built in 1681, and it was lived in by the prior pastor of the village. The one on the left was not from this era. It was built in the 1800s, but they were both unearthed because of the research of William Trask, who is the archivist of the city of Danvers, also a descendant of both accusers and accused, convicted individuals during the Salem witchcraft trials. Do we have any more there, Nicole? This is the house, the homestead of Rebecca Nurse. This is on the same site as the meeting house. Rebecca Nurse is featured in the book. She was a 70-year-old woman regarded by most of the people in the village as a saint. In the parlance of the church at that time, one was either a sinner or a saint. She was well known to be a pious woman who was accused of being a witch, not by Tituba, but by some of the other accusers in the village. She was the matron of a very large family, and she was so devout. And in the book, Tituba, I go through some of the proceedings in the hearings of how these women were actually accused and forced into impossible positions of trying to deny something that didn't exist. We know that none of these individuals were actually witches. At the time, a witch was someone that Satan or the devil had tempted to doing Satan's will. The theology was that the devil could not hurt people. The devil had to use people or animals to hurt individuals, to tempt them, to bribe them into signing the book of promising to serve him. Well, this house still remains. This is the original structure. It's, of course, been refurbished from time to time, but inside it is exactly like it would have been at the time that Rebecca Nurse and her family were alive. You can't see it very well there, and of course, that Weber charcoal grill didn't exist back in 1692, but I couldn't get it out of the picture before I showed it to you. So that's a long answer to your question, Ellen.
Thank you, Dave. There was just a TV program on, I think it was Sunday night maybe, about the witch trials in England, in Scotland specifically. And it was Lucy Worsley who does these documentary programs, but some of the similarities between like the Puritans in Scotland and then how that carried over into the United States.
Yes.
And I keep thinking about these Puritan ideas. It seems that we still have lingering in the country. You know, they're behind different things, and you know that's very interesting as well. And the whole idea of these forced confessions that they had these women do, and after torturing them, then suddenly they'd confess to something, and it's very horrific that you know.
Well, that's a very apt point, Ellen. One last point about Rebecca Nurse. She was so devout that after repeated examination, cross-examination, she essentially said, maybe I have committed some sin that I don't know about, and God has visited this on me as my punishment. So there was this deep, deep faith in some of these people, but everyone at the time believed that in this harsh world where Puritans who came to the Salem area around 1620 had expanded over the years, these were rough people. As I said, I was ignorant of this region's history. All I knew was the Puritans allegedly had a banquet with the Indians they stole land from. That's kind of it. Roger and the Mayflower Compact that set a basis for democracy. Well, these people, Puritans in particular, they were hated in England by the Anglicans. The Puritans eventually made it to the United States, to America, where they hated Lutherans and Anabaptists and Quakers, and of course they were users of even slave labor. A very good book I recently read by a historian from the West Coast documents that in New England in colonial times, 1 in 10 inhabitants was a slave. Who knew? I mean, did any of us know that? I certainly didn't. Cotton Mather, who was also one of the antagonists in my story, owned slaves. Cotton Mather is a giant in the history of religion. His father, particularly Increase Mather, was larger in scope and more famous.
Hello.
But these were men who basically helped define and carry through this theology that we're living in a very difficult world, and we have to keep our eye out because Satan is here and he's manipulating people to capture us. They believed they were either preordained to heaven, and it didn't matter what they did on earth if they were preordained, but they had to be good to live the life that they hoped God had intended for them to live so they could get to heaven too. The witchcraft that occurred in England and Europe was far greater than what happened here in New England. Hundreds of thousands, by some determinations, of people were executed for heresy, and witchcraft, of course, was heresy. In Europe, Protestants executed witches, Catholics executed witches. It didn't matter what country you were in or what was the dominant state religion. This was widespread. And of course, it was mostly, guess who? Women. Because in this society, as in some say, even in today, not some, I believe that even today, that the way women are treated is not the way of equal treatment under the Constitution and the laws. But in England, in Europe, and Scotland, they burned witches. They burned them at the stake. In the United States, they were hanged. So there was a difference there, but the similarities resonate through history.
Yeah, I saw there was a movement now to commemorate over there some of the people that had been lost, and they're erecting some statues and like memorials to the women that they killed.
Yes, and this goes on also. I think it actually started earlier than what's going on in Europe, although they are being responsible for, in this area. But in Salem town itself, the events are treated with great respect. historians have labored to try to identify where the hangings occurred. Monuments are put up to these people. They're not ostentatious or tall, but they're sober reminders that these were human beings who were accused of something that was that they were unable to disprove. And one other thing I wanted to get at, and I have it in the book extensively, because for me, I wanted to give Tituba agency. I wanted to show her as a woman of color, a Black woman, who had a reason for doing what she did, because no one can ever know. And I wanted to blend in with that my awareness of how people of color, Africans, American Indians, who were also enslaved in New England, and women were treated as second-class human beings. So I wanted to humanize Tituba. And so I gave her this fanciful power to create specters out of revenge. Her son in the story, Akani, was rebellious. He was a teenager, and eventually the master tried to sell him off. When he did, Akani tried to escape and was killed. And for me, this is the element that switched Tituba from an appeaser. Her name, Tituba, is roughly translated into go and appease. Her mother told her that she needed to appease in order to survive slavery. But the death of her son flipped Tituba's switch, and her mother had passed on to her magical powers from the ancients in Africa. And Tituba created spectral images of the people she was accusing. These spectral evidence are in actuality, in real history, were used as evidence by people who thought they saw images of the accused people doing witchcraft. This was called spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was permitted in trial. The judges would allow someone to say, when I was in bed, I saw the image of Martha Corey. She came and sat on my chest and deviled me and wanted me to do this or that. There are several instances in the story which I took exactly from history and from the testimony in the hearings describing women whose images were alleged to have done witchcraft and harmed other people in the village. Can you imagine how that could be abused? Could you imagine a jealous wife or a jealous woman who was jealous of a man's wife who could say, I saw her image hurting someone, pinching the girls. This was one of the common injuries that were inflicted: pinching, pressing, hurting, scaring. And these were all done by spectral images. They were never used in evidence after these trials. Unfortunately, it caused the death of 19 people who were hanged.
Kathy added a question in the chat. What was some of the most surprising information you came across in your research, or that you found out about yourself during the writing process?
Yeah. I work for the Human Relations Commission of Pennsylvania, investigating gender and racial discrimination. But over a lifetime of raising a family, helping to raise a family, educating children, teaching them, trying to earn a living through my law practice, I didn't have the opportunity to ever speak about what I learned. And as I researched Tituba, who I characterize as an African woman, I realized that there was something I wanted to say. And I wanted to say it about the discrimination against Blacks, women, American Indians, and I wanted to say it to my readers. I didn't expect that my book would be read overwhelmingly by Black people. To the degree people have read the book, and it's sold very well to my pleasure and surprise, it's been the white audience I expected. And I just wanted that to be, I discovered that's what I wanted to do as I was writing the book. So it brought something out that had been tucked away in my mind for 30 years after I had worked in civil rights. And it gave me an opportunity as a white European American to say to my cohort of white Americans, you know what? Today, most of us don't know people of color. Most of us don't really understand deep down that America includes Black people and women. There was a man on in politics recently who said, I don't understand all this teaching about slavery now. Before the revolution, nobody talked about slavery. And I'll bet almost everyone that heard that thought, no, they didn't. But there were 3 million Black people who talked about slavery every day of their lives because it's two Americas. And we don't yet have a way to come to grips with that. I wasn't going to shake the world, but I wanted to say to people, you know what? Think about how you consider yourself if you're white, and how you consider people of color. To men, how you think of yourself, but how you think of women as your work colleagues, your daughters, your spouses. And that's what I learned that I wanted to put into a book. At the same time, I wanted to write a damn good book that entertained and enlightened people at the same time.
Your book brings up some strangely relevant ideas. What do you see in your book that is still here today, and how do you see your book as addressing this? What lessons can be learned?
Oof. Well, I'm still learning them. I didn't really try to have a message when I wrote this book, but as I was doing it, I wanted to humanize, as I was just saying, to humanize people who are not yet equal to the white patriarchal society that we have. So one of the things I learned was that these people had a rough life. They argued over everything. They were in litigation constantly. The courts were places where disputes were settled. You look around today and you see how many people are involved in litigation, if not litigation, rough talk about each other. And it seems as though greed and what used to be civility, greed is now, I don't know, kind of at the top of the agenda when it comes to our society. I really didn't want to get into politics, nor do I really have a desire to preach in that area. I know about as much as anybody, which is, I'm not a politician. But I understand that today, when you hear about critical race theory and people that object to Americans understanding that there is systemic racism in America. If it wasn't systemic, white people wouldn't have the edge we have. White people, our country is a wonderful place. We've done so many fabulous things in our history. The Constitution that our founders created was an example of government that had never existed, ever. And here today, we're still arguing over what was the intention of the founders. Was it to have a republic where people would have equal opportunity or not? So I think that there are similarities there, the arguments, disputing as well as recognizing that it's not just the relationship of, no, I'm not racist, I don't discriminate. That's not enough. People have to at least have an open mind and listen to people of color, to not dismiss what they say about systemic roadblocks that prevent our society from being a fair and just place to live. So, I see that. I see Christian nationalism, which is not Christianity. It's politics that uses Christianity. But I see that today, evangelical Christians, although they're not Christian nationalists, are not fighting against them because of some of the positions that they take. That I think more education has to happen then in these areas in particular. These are conflicts that are so complex. There's no one answer, but we need to have them discussed openly. And that's why I think, the arguments about book burning and ideas that should be suppressed is so pernicious. I mean, everybody that's listening today, I can't imagine anyone disagreeing that it's so pernicious. The idea of hiding thoughts from the public. So I see those as things that existed back then. There were no, by the way, newspapers weren't allowed in 1692. The government controlled what could be printed. We don't have that today, but it was such a closed society then, and we have to continue fighting to have an open society in America today. Otherwise, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes, as Mark Twain said.
Annette asks if you think that ergot fungus poisoning was a cause for the hysteria.
Yeah, I don't. The thesis for the ergot, which has similar chemical properties as LSD, it was a fungus that somehow attaches to rye, and rye was raised as well as wheat and corn for grains to make bread. The theory was first put forward by Linda Corporeal, I think, if I'm saying it right. She was a student at UC California, Berkeley. And her theory was that this fungus, ergot, got into the grain, and that certain people in eating the grain began to hallucinate and accuse others of witchcraft. I think that, so she was an undergraduate when she wrote this. And then in the late 1970s, a science magazine put it out. So there's no way to disprove it except to say that it's only a hypothesis. It's not a theory. A theory has facts to back it up. The hypothesis will never have the facts. And I find it hard to understand how some people in a household who, if they had eaten and been poisoned by this ergot, and had hallucinations that doctors thought was being bewitched, how other people in their family didn't. I mean, they all shared the same bread. And to me, that's like the bedrock. There were many people in the village who had neither hallucinations, nor did they have the hallucination of seeing spectral evidence. So, both the bewitched as well as the accusers who said they saw something that could not have existed, there were people in their own households who didn't. So, to me, that hypothesis is creative. It's thoughtful. It's been debated for 40 years, 60 years now. my math. That's why I became a lawyer. I can't do math. But since the late 70s anyway. So I tend to not agree with it. I think the complex causes were far deeper. It was this life of avoiding sin, yet trying to live a life where you had to struggle and be hard and tough at the same time. It was this pounding of this belief that man was destined to hell or heaven, and that the children were taught these fearful things from the beginning of when they could understand. They had to read. Many people in these villages could read, but they could not write. And I think they simply memorized boards like with the Lord's Prayer on it, so that they could see the words, but they couldn't really read. And they were taught that evil was everywhere, that Native Americans were dark people that Satan had set up in North America as an alternative place for his minions, and that they were living a life to take it back. So the causes could have been economic. The people in Salem Village were farmers. The people in Salem were merchants. They had conflicting views on what autonomy each should have. Samuel Parris, as I talk about in the book, became the first ordained minister in Salem so they could have their own church. This was a big thing for them. So, yeah, I don't think I have anything to add after that. I don't especially believe in the ergot theory. It was way too complex.
Nicole added, I think one of the biggest myths I learned in school is that people are no longer convicted off of circumstantial evidence.
Here's circumstantial evidence for lawyers. Oh, I don't have a lawyer's hat anymore, so I can't put it on. But evidence can be strong evidence, it can be weak evidence, and everything in between. And circumstantial evidence is, in my opinion, I'm not advising anybody here because I can't represent you, is the weakest form of evidence. People will try to present it to win an argument, whether it's over property or whether someone should be put in prison, of what evidence is permissible in court. But our laws of evidence today are so far advanced from what they were under English common law in colonial New England that there's always a debate about evidence, but certainly not such a travesty as existed then.
There are a couple questions here about Tituba herself. Kathy added, some of the books I've read about the witch trials say it was targeting midwives or other women healers. Was Tituba a midwife or healer? And also Amy asks if Tituba was represented in the historical record, and do we have any information about her?
Yes, there's very little information about Tituba. One of the, specifically about her. What was the first part of the question?
Kathy asked if she was a midwife or a healer, like if certain types of women were targeted.
Yeah, there's no evidence that she had specific skills known in the community. Thinking back to 1692, this was rugged living. People heated their house as best they could by open fireplaces, the most inefficient method possible. They were living in an environment where medicine was so speculative. The practice of medicine was so speculative that people relied on folk medicine. Some people were accused in the Salem witchcraft trial of doing witchcraft when they had a reputation for being an herbalist or a midwife. But this is part of history. This is how women have been condemned throughout history. Women being the caregivers in their families, yet when they exercise care, they become accused of doing the very things they were doing, but with a nefarious purpose. So there's no record of Tituba. I encourage any of our listeners, aside from reading my book, that they read actual history of this era. So Tituba is so poorly covered in history that there is no absolute certainty whether she was an African or from Indian peoples in the New World. Modern scholars have tried to interpret the scant evidence that exists that she most likely was Indian. But I see holes in that research. For example, two prominent researchers, Elaine Breslau and Marilyn Rausch, have said that they have discovered evidence that when Samuel Parris came to Boston and then to Salem, he brought with him Tituba, John Indian, and a Negro, as the records state, child. One of them thinks the child was a female, the other a male. Well, I'm thinking in the record of the trials, Tituba is mentioned as the spouse of John Indian. And if this child accompanied them, this child also being enslaved, I said to myself, well, I'm writing fiction. I want this character, and it's logical to me, as logical as some of the other evidence, that she was African and not native to the New World. Some speculate that she was a Caribbean Indian. I think I found evidence that dispels that. But I'm not a historian. I'm a fiction writer, and I wanted to write a good story. So there are some very good books out. The most famous recently is Witches by Stacy Schiff. But there are other deep historical record writers who live in the New England area who have spent a lifetime researching and publishing on this. But that's one of the things that attracted me to Tituba, that there was so little known about her. And let me add, here's what we know for what the reality was. Tituba spent almost a year and a half in jail after she was bound over for trial. As bad as the legal system was, they still had to have a grand jury bind someone over to a criminal trial. And everyone that was hanged in Salem their case had been put forward to a grand jury. Tituba's case was actually brought to the grand jury twice. And on both times, they failed to render a verdict that she should be bound over for trial. Speculation, or some of the historical record, is that they didn't believe her story. Tituba's testimony in the hearings where she accused other people somehow, to some people, was not worthy of belief as to convicting her or binding her over to trial. But for other people, it was enough to condemn other people to trial and to be hanged. After Tituba was not indicted twice by a grand jury, she remained in jail. The law at that time was, if you were ever found not guilty, or the case was dropped, you had to pay the fees of the jailer. I talk about this in the book. That's one of the reasons Tituba remained in jail so long. Reverend Samuel Parris, her master, her quote owner, failed to pay the fees for her food, for some of the salary for the jailers, even for the manacles that were used on her ankles or her wrists. You had to pay for that, and he didn't pay. History has not told us what happened to Tituba, so we speculate. And in my novel, Tituba, the Intentional Witch of Salem, you have to read the book to find out.
For our authors and authors-to-be in the audience, what was
Yes.
your process for getting this work published and turned into an audiobook?
Boy, that was a journey too. We could take a whole nother hour to talk about it. So I'll kind of go through the highlights. One, I tried to sell it and I couldn't sell it. I went through dozens and dozens and dozens of agents who would not give it a second look. Eventually, I set a time limit, and it turns out the time limit was January of 2020. And if I didn't have a contract by then, I was going to do it myself. I had always kept in the back of my mind, what am I going to do if I can't sell the book to a publisher? And I put so much work into it in learning the craft of writing, hiring expert editors. And believe me, no book that you ever come across was written by one person with their genius for writing. Every work that you read is the result of a collaboration. And it's a collaboration between the creator author and editors and other editors and readings and rereadings that produces a final product. And I was not willing to have this disappear into a drawer. So guess what else happened in 2020? Yeah, March 2020, COVID. So when everything was shut down, I was free to research the death out of how do you publish a book? And I did. One of the great things that happened is I heard about the Afro-American Genealogical and Historical Society Fiction Award, that you had to have the book at least published on Amazon to enter the contest. And the deadline was May 15th. And somehow by May 15th, I had done it. Reviewed and reread typographically. And I couldn't believe it. But Tituba won the Historical Fiction Award. This was like confirmation to me that this was a worthy book that I could talk to my white readers about without worrying that I was off on another planet, making up stuff about a culture that I knew nothing about. Nobody knows about Black culture in 1692 in the parsonage in Salem. So that happened. I also had the book published on Amazon in print and ebook. What a journey it was. And it's something that you have to really ask yourself, why am I writing when you start to write? And you have to ask yourself that question over and over as you go through the journey. There are so many different reasons to write memoir or nonfiction or fiction, that the author has to ask that question repeatedly as they go through the journey. Even if I had to do it myself. There's a kind of a joke that people used to say, writing a book and letting others read it is like being a father walking the baby carriage down the street and someone looking inside and saying, my God, what an ugly baby. The fear that someone would say that about your work. But anyway, I'm so gratified. So many people have supported me in the work. So many people have supported in book reviews and Amazon. And like I said, the award of winning that historical fiction award made such a difference. Then I decided I was going to do something that I didn't realize how much of a bigger bite I had to take. And everybody says audiobooks are great. So I started listening to audiobooks. And I said to myself, I was an actor in high school. I can do this. Well, at first I couldn't. It took months of practicing and working with a professional audio engineer. And by gosh, it took us almost 5-6 months to produce a finished product, but we did. And that audiobook is available on Amazon. It's available through any place people buy books. In fact, in libraries, it's available through Overdrive and Hoopla, as well as the ebook. So I was mentioning this morning, I just found out that Tituba is now being sold on Spotify. How did it get there? I don't know, but it is. So I hope you can see from my demeanor that it's been the adventure of a lifetime, and one that I'm going to stick with for a while.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tamanini. I love the creative elements that you added to the story, as long as, and also learning about all these historical elements. I do want to say that we have some Salem witch books at the state library even. I think we have some accounts from the trials themselves. And I remember seeing in the Rare Collections book some like 1600s books on, denouncing witches. So we'll have to do a special exhibit or something of these historic books once we get back into our forum building. So
Yes.
Thank you again, Dave, for giving us this talk. There's a link, everyone, in the chat about how to learn more about Dave, purchase his book right there on his website. And I think that's all the housekeeping stuff. This was being recorded. We will have it up on our website, like Nicole said, in a couple weeks. So check that out as well. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Ellen. It's been a joy to talk, and thank you, everybody, for staying with the program.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.